The laughter started before the seatbelt sign had even turned off. "Would you look at him?" a passenger muttered loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. Heads turned toward the back, where a man sat by the window in row 24. His clothes were torn and frayed, the kind of fabric that had clearly seen years of hard labor. On his head, a faded turban rested firmly, a proud piece of heritage that only seemed to fuel the mockery. A group of well-dressed passengers exchanged smirks. One of them, a man in a tailored blazer, leaned forward, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Guess the airline's running charity now. Farmers in rags flying with the rest of us? What's next? Chickens in first class?" The remark drew sharp laughter. Another passenger chimed in, pointing at the man's patched trousers. "Careful, he might have fleas. I hope he doesn't stink up the whole row." The farmer didn't react. His face was calm, eyes steady, hands folded loosely in his lap. The quiet dignity in his stillness only seemed to irritate his tormentors more. "Hey, turban man!" the one in the blazer called out, louder this time. "Don't doze off and start drooling. Some of us paid real money for this ride." The words echoed, pulling uneasy glances from passengers nearby. Some shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. They simply pretended to be busy with magazines and screens, afraid to draw attention to themselves. The farmer finally turned his head, his gaze resting briefly on his mockers. There was no anger in his eyes, only a silence so heavy it made the laughter falter. Slowly, he adjusted the edge of his turban, sat straighter, and looked back out at the endless sky beyond the window. That simple gesture carried more weight than any insult. It wasn't defiance. It was something deeper, an unshakable calm, as if he had already weathered storms far greater than Poe. These petty jabs. The cabin grew quieter, but tension lingered like a storm cloud. The entitled passengers exchanged uneasy looks, unwilling to admit that their ridicule was beginning to feel small. Outside, the engines roared as the plane pierced through layers of cloud. Inside, a different kind of turbulence was brewing, one that no one on board could yet predict. Because the man they mocked was not what he seemed, and soon the entire plane would find out the truth. Long before the taunts of strangers echoed inside that plane, life had already tested him in ways they could never imagine. The fields were his first classroom. From dawn until the sun bled into the horizon, he bent his back to the soil, guiding oxen through furrows, planting seed after seed with hands that grew rough and scarred. Each season carried its own battle, droughts that cracked the land, storms that washed away entire harvests, and the relentless weight of debt that hung over his family like a shadow. "Your place is here," people told him, their voices sharp and certain. "You'll never be more than a farmer. Men like you don't rise higher." But he never answered with words. His reply came in the rhythm of sweat dripping onto the earth, in the quiet endurance that kept him sowing even when the yield was barely enough to survive. Poverty clothed him in torn fabric, but it never stripped away his pride. Neighbors underestimated him. Strangers mocked him. Even buyers at the market treated him like he was invisible. But behind his silence was a mind always working, calculating, dreaming of a day when the seeds he planted would grow into something far larger than crops. Now, seated thousands of feet above the ground, the jeers of his fellow passengers carried the same sting as those market insults. Their laughter was just another version of the doubt he had faced all his life. Yet he sat steady, his eyes reflecting a man who had already walked through fire and come out whole, because what they didn't know was this: every season of struggle had prepared him for moments exactly like this one. And soon, the storm in the cabin would reveal just how much he had grown from those roots. The snickers didn't fade. They grew louder. What had started as whispers now turned into a cruel performance for the entire cabin. "Seriously," one man scoffed, his voice sharp enough to cut through the hum of the engines. "How does a ragged farmer even afford a ticket like this? Did he pawn his tractor?" Laughter erupted from his companions, harsh and echoing. Another leaned forward, eyes gleaming with arrogance. "Maybe he's never been on a plane before." Careful, old man. Don't press the wrong button and open the window. The cruel joke sent ripples of uneasy amusement through the rows. A few passengers chuckled nervously, desperate to avoid becoming targets themselves. Others shifted in discomfort, eyes darting toward the man in the turban, then quickly away. No one dared to intervene. The farmer adjusted in his seat, lowering the brim of his turban slightly, as if shielding himself from their gaze. His silence was steady, unbroken, and strangely powerful, like the calm before a storm. The mockers took his composure as weakness. One snapped his fingers toward the flight attendant. "Hey, are you sure he's in the right seat? People like him usually ride in the cargo hold." The attendant's polite smile faltered, but she said nothing, moving quickly down the aisle. The bullies laughed harder, convinced of their superiority. But others began to feel it. That weight in the air, that shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just turbulence outside the windows. It was something stirring inside the cabin, a tension that pressed against the skin, hinting that this silent man was not what he appeared. The farmer's hand rested on the armrest, his knuckles steady, his breath even. He didn't need to answer their insults. His very silence was unsettling, a quiet reminder that storms don't roar before they break. And as the laughter rang hollow across the cabin, a shadow of unease flickered in the eyes of those mocking him. They had no idea that the turbulence they feared was already on its way. Only this time, it wouldn't come from the skies. The laughter carried through the rows, but not everyone found it amusing. Beneath the noise, quieter voices began to stir. "Shameful," a woman whispered to her husband, her eyes darting toward the bullies. "Why don't they just leave him alone?" Her husband sighed, shaking his head. "People like that. They think mocking others makes them important." Another passenger leaned toward her friend, muttering, "He hasn't said a single word back. And still they keep pushing. It's embarrassing for them." These murmurs never rose above the level of secrecy, tucked between the drone of the engines and the bursts of cruel laughter. No one dared to speak aloud. No one dared to challenge the mockers head-on. Courage was scarce at 30,000 feet. Through it all, the farmer sat unmoved. His hands rested loosely on his knees, his face calm, his turban still and dignified. His silence spoke louder than any defense the others might have offered. The contrast was striking, the noise of arrogance against the weight of quiet strength. And then it happened. The plane gave a sudden jolt, rattling trays and sending a ripple of unease through the cabin. Drinks trembled in their cups. Overhead bins rattled faintly. Nervous chuckles broke out, this time not directed at the farmer, but at the invisible force outside shaking them all. The bullies fell silent for a moment, gripping their armrests. The cabin shifted, not just from the turbulence, but from something else. A creeping sense that the balance of power was changed. No one realized it yet, but the storm inside this plane had only just begun. The turbulence faded, but the tension inside the cabin lingered. Passengers shifted uneasily, the silence thicker now than before. That's when a flight attendant walked briskly down the aisle, her expression calm but her movements purposeful. She stopped beside the farmer's seat, and to everyone's surprise, leaned slightly forward. Her voice softened, respectful, carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "Sir, is everything to your comfort? Do you need anything at all?" The cabin froze. It wasn't the question, it was the tone. Not pity. Not courtesy reserved for any passenger. It was respect. Genuine, deliberate respect. The mockers blinked in confusion. One scoffed under his breath. Comfort? For him? He's lucky they even let him on board. But the farmer didn't rise to the bait. Slowly, he lifted his eyes from the window and met the attendant's gaze. A faint smile touched his lips, subtle and knowing, as though they shared a secret no one else understood. "No," he replied softly, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just fine. Thank you." There was something in the way he spoke, measured, steady, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. The attendant nodded respectfully before moving on, leaving the mockers staring after her, baffled. "Did you see that?" one whispered. "Why is she treating him like some VIP?" The farmer adjusted the edge of his turban, his smile lingering for just a second longer. That quiet composure, that glimmer of something more, unsettled his tormentors far more than any angry retort ever could. Because in that moment, everyone around him felt it. The faint but undeniable presence of a man used to being respected. And soon, the reason for that respect would shake the entire cabin. It began with a sudden drop, sharp enough to make every stomach lurch at once. Trays rattled, cups tipped, and startled gasps filled the cab. In. Before anyone could recover, the plane jolted again, harder this time, sending half-filled drinks splashing onto laps and bags tumbling from open compartments above. Screams broke out. The same passengers who had been laughing moments earlier now clawed at their armrests, eyes wide with panic. "What's happening?" one of them cried, voice trembling. Another fumbled for the call button, shouting, "Is this safe? Somebody do something!" The laughter was gone. In its place, raw, unfiltered fear. The aircraft shook violently, lights flickering as if the storm outside had reached inside. Passengers clutched at one another, whispers of prayers mixing with cries of alarm. Even the flight attendants, usually calm, braced themselves against the walls, their smiles replaced by urgent instructions. And yet, in the midst of chaos, one figure remained steady: the farmer. While others gripped their seats in terror, he sat upright, his hands calmly folded, his gaze fixed out the window, as though watching a passing rain. His breathing was slow, even, utterly at odds with the panic around him. The man in the blazer noticed, his own face pale with dread. "Why isn't he panicking?" he stammered to his companion. But there was no answer, because the truth was undeniable. The farmer's composure made their own fear look small, childish even. He looked like a man who had weathered storms far greater than turbulence. As the plane steadied for a moment, silence swept across the cabin. Passengers glanced nervously at the calm figure in row 24, their fear mingling with curiosity. Who was this man who faced chaos with such unshakable strength? The storm outside had passed for now, but inside, another storm was just about to break. The cabin still trembled with the echo of fear. Passengers whispered nervously, some clutching their armrests, others wiping sweat from their brows. The storm outside had eased, but inside, hearts were still racing. Then a chime rang through the speakers. The intercom crackled to life. Everyone braced for the captain's voice, hoping for reassurance. But the voice that followed was not the captain's. "Ladies and gentlemen," the calm, steady tone began, "I hope you're all comfortable now that the turbulence has passed. Allow me to properly introduce myself." Heads turned, eyes widened. The voice was familiar. Passengers looked around in disbelief, until their gazes all landed on row 24. It was him, the farmer. Gasps rippled through the cabin, louder than any wave of turbulence. The very man they had mocked was speaking over the plane's intercom. "I am not just your fellow passenger," he continued, his words deliberate, every syllable carrying authority. "I am the chief executive officer of this airline, the very one ensuring your safety in the skies today." Silence fell, thick and absolute. The mockers sat frozen, their mouths half open, the color draining from their faces. The laughter that had once filled the air now seemed like a ghost haunting them. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. Another passenger whispered, almost in awe, He owns the airline?" The farmer, no, the CEO, glanced calmly at the bullies across the aisle. He didn't sneer. He didn't gloat. Instead, he adjusted the edge of his turban with quiet dignity, letting the truth speak louder than revenge ever could. For the first time on that flight, the arrogant passengers dropped their eyes. Their arrogance collapsed into shame, their voices silenced not by turbulence, but by truth. And in that silence, the entire cabin realized. The man they had mocked had been the one holding the real power all along. The storm had passed, but its aftermath would change the way everyone looked at him, forever. The announcement still echoed in the minds of every passenger, hanging in the air like thunder after a storm. A hush blanketed the cabin, heavier than the turbulence that it had shaken it minutes before. The mockers, the ones who had laughed the loudest, now sat pale and rigid. Their eyes darted anywhere but row 24. The arrogance that had fueled their voices was gone, replaced by a shame so raw it burned through their silence. One man clenched his jaw, pretending to read the safety card, though his trembling hands betrayed him. Across the aisle, passengers who had once looked away now stared openly. Their expressions shifted, some filled with admiration, others with guilt. They remembered their whispers, their silence when the farmer was ridiculed, and now they felt the weight of what they hadn't done. But the man at the window, the CEO they had mocked, didn't revel in their discomfort. He didn't raise his voice or return their cruelty. Instead, he sat as he always had, calm, steady, composed. His turban framed a face that radiated quiet dignity. He did not need to gloat. His truth alone commanded their respect. One passenger leaned toward another, whispering softly, "I should have said something. We all should have." The words carried the sting of regret, echoing in hearts that knew they had failed. And still, the farmer remained silent. Yet that silence was louder than any speech. It carried authority. It carried grace. It carried the unmistakable presence of a man who had nothing left to prove. The plane soared onward through the calm skies, but inside, the passengers knew they had just witnessed something life-altering. And as they sat in reverent quiet, the story of who this man truly was began to unfold even deeper. Before he was a man commanding the skies, he was a boy walking barefoot across cracked soil. His journey began with a wooden plough and calloused hands, carving life out of earth that offered little in return. Each sunrise brought labor. Each sunset left him weary. Yet with every seed he planted, he also planted a dream that hardship would not define his destiny. He studied the land, learned its secrets, and grew from a simple farmer into a supplier. From supplier into a leader of men who trusted his vision. Season after season, his fields grew richer, not just with crops, but with opportunity. Where others saw dirt, he saw empire. Where others gave up, he endured. And from the wealth of his harvest, he built something greater. He expanded, investing beyond the soil. First storage and transport, then technology. And when the world told him a farmer had no business reaching further, he looked higher, toward the skies. Piece by piece, he bought into an airline that once seemed as distant as the clouds above his farm. With patience and grit, he rose from rows of crops to rows of aircraft, each plane a symbol of how far he had come. His turban and worn clothes might fool the shallow-eyed, but behind them stood a man who had turned struggle into strength and strength into legacy. And as the passengers sat in silence, they were about to learn the final truth his journey carried. The wheels touched down with a heavy thud, the runway lights streaking past in golden blurs. The passengers exhaled as one, relief mixing with the silence that had hung in the air since the truth was revealed. The storm was over, both outside and in, yet no one felt the same as they had when they boarded. The plane slowed, engines roaring as it eased toward the terminal. Passengers shifted in their seats, but not a word was spoken. Their eyes, however, said everything. They darted again and again to row 24, where the man in the torn clothes and turban sat, as calm as ever, the man they had mocked. The man they had feared. The man they had discovered was the CEO of the very airline carrying them safely home. The seatbelt sign chimed, and passengers rose hesitantly. But before anyone could move down the aisle, the farmer CEO stood. He didn't push, didn't boast. He simply collected his small bag, adjusted his turban with quiet dignity, and stepped forward. The crowd parted instinctively, cleaved, earing his path without a word. Some bowed their heads in shame. Others looked on with admiration, eyes filled with the lesson they had learned too late. The mockers who had jeered now sat frozen, unable to lift their gaze. Their arrogance had dissolved into a silence heavier than any insult. And as the farmer walked down the aisle, first to step off the plane, he carried himself not with pride, but with humility. For he knew that true power doesn't demand recognition. It commands respect without a single word spoken. The camera of the story now lingers on the stunned passengers left behind, each of them reflecting on their judgment, their silence, their failure to see beyond appearances. And here is the lesson that takes flight beyond the cabin. Never underestimate the quiet ones. Never assume a person's worth by their clothes, their accent, or the dirt beneath their nails, because the very soul you mock may be the one keeping you safe at 30,000 feet. The plane had landed, but for everyone on board, the journey of understanding had only just begun.